Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined, first of all, by Guy Burton.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good, Guy. Thanks very much for coming on the show. And I'm also joined by Francesco Belcastro. Guys, thanks very much for coming on the show. How are we doing?
Hi, Rory. I'm fine. I'm a bit offended you introduced Guy first, but I'll deal with that.
Of course, our listeners may know these guys as the hosts of the FootPol Podcast, which has been a staple of the football podcasting universe for the last couple of years or so, I think.
Yes, a year and a few months, yes.
A year and a few months, yeah. And they're joining me today as kind of a part of a second leg from when we were on their recording. That was back in summer. I think that was about June or July, so it's a while ago now. And we're really going to be kind of carrying on that conversation. Now, as the name suggests, the FootPol Podcast is about everything to do with politics and football, no matter what iteration that may take. And there are many iterations. And yeah, I mean, today we are just going to be talking about everything to do with politics and football, why it's important that politics is a part of football, and kind of debunking a few of these myths about how they shouldn't be intertwined, politics and football should be separate and all this kind of stuff. So it's going to be quite a good conversation. But just before we kick things off, first of all, Francesco, why don't you tell our listeners...
Thank you.
Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
So I am a senior lecturer at the University of Derby in the UK. I do a few things, but I think that the one that is more relevant to this conversation is part of my research is on sport and politics, largely football, but not only. And I've looked at a few different things, but I can summarize it in two areas. So both me and Guy actually have got a bit of a sort of Middle East scholarly background. So I've done a bit of things on sport and politics in the Middle East and some work on institutions. And a bit of an identity as well. I'm quite interested in sort of diaspora clubs, so clubs that sort of represent communities abroad, and that's how I got to the podcast. But to give credit to Guy, the podcast is very much his idea. So
brilliant, thanks very much. Well, Guy, that's quite a nice way to introduce yourself. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your role within the podcast and what you do as well?
Yeah, thank you. Well, so I would probably count myself more of a recovering academic because I'm in between positions. You know, I've taught in a number of different universities. In fact, actually, I mean, Francesco alludes to the fact that we have a Middle East background, which is true, but actually I started out as a Latin Americanist. And having a background there, I think, well, it's as football related as you can get, isn't it? I mean, unlike Francesco, I haven't actually done any writing myself on football and politics or social issues. Really, the idea came to me about a year, I'd say coming up for nearly 2 years ago. I was standing on the terrace, enjoying this game, then finding myself thinking, yeah, there is an awful lot of podcasting going on out there, and but a lot of it's very football focused, football related. Sort of the game itself. And I realized that I'm not really that kind of person, but I am interested in sort of how football and politics or political issues relate to each other. And it reminded me of a conversation because Francesco and I are part of a group up at Lancaster University that look at Middle East issues and sectarian issues. And Francesco had done a seminar online and presented his work on sport and football and said, I really want to do some more, and I'm trying to think about what sort of subject matter to cover. And I just thought, well, rather than having to go out and find new research, I mean, there's already a whole body of work out there. Why don't we just talk to people about the work that they're doing? And that's kind of where FootPol sprang from. We wanted to sort of give voice to people who are working on this subject. And then Francesco said, that's a great idea. What do you know about podcasting? And I said, nothing at all. And what do you know about podcasting? He said, absolutely nothing. So once we agreed on the idea and the concept and who we were going to talk to, we then spent, a couple of months learning the skills of how to record, edit, do all of that, promote it on social media. So it's been a fun project. I think we also should stress that out. This has been a fun project, I think, to do.
That's amazing. Yeah, I didn't actually know that you guys had basically to learn this trade, if you want to say that, from the ground up. That's absolutely amazing. I love the dedication to doing that. I mean, as our listeners will know, that's very much up my street. Francesco, as you mentioned there, the identity side of things and diaspora clubs is very much an interest of mine as well. And Guy, from what you said there, in terms of talking about the politics of football within sectarianism, particularly in the Middle East, very much in the vein of James Montague, When Saturday Comes, that book really comes to mind. So I think there's quite a lot of crossover on this podcast with yourselves in terms of your interests as well. Obviously, our main focus is heritage. And that can be anything from, historic stadiums and structures within football, but also the intangible things like fan identities. And that's really where politics kind of comes into it, I suppose. I think that's probably where the crossover comes in, and we're going to be kind of unpicking this a little bit and talking about it through this episode, and hopefully gives our listeners a little bit more of an idea as to what our opinions are and our thought processes are behind the things that we talk about and the things that we discuss, because it can be quite complicated and it's not the easiest thing to go and research if it's not something that you're familiar with. So just to start off, I think the best place for us to begin would be to give the context. What do we mean by politics in football?
I mean, when we talk about politics, we're really talking about power in the broadest sense possible. And so, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're looking inside the game or around the game. We see power dynamics. Whether it's between football clubs, and you can think about this in terms of sort of just sheer material wealth. Some clubs have more money than others. That gives them sort of a different sort of. It's an unbalanced playing field in that respect off the pitch, but also sort of the relationship between fans and clubs. Obviously, how much influence do fans have over what clubs themselves do, and that sort of brings you into discussions about sort of ownership models. I mean, and I think we're interested in doing something on the German model because, of course, that gets a lot of attention. If fans are part of the club, and in fact, actually, we've looked at community clubs as well. But then, of course, there's sort of dynamics that are going on that what broader issues going on as well. So if you think about public attitudes regarding issues. So we've looked at issues to do with racism, and it came through in the conversation we had with Christos Kazimieris, the professor who has spent years looking at racism in football. He says, look, football itself is not racist. It's just a social phenomenon, a social construct through which all these other things play through. So, racism can play out in the stadium. It's because of people having those racist attitudes. So we take it in a very, very broad way. Obviously the most sort of concrete examples I can think of are of these like diaspora, community clubs, which represent a particular community. But then, of course, we've also interested in and we've tried to do this, like looking at areas of football that are untapped or untouched. So e-football, for example, because, e-football there is, it's a game, people play that. But also the thing we're interested in is where is the power in all of this? Who are the companies that control this? What is the relationship between e-football to broader governance issues?
I just want to add to what Guy said. What is quite clear to me after 1 year and something with the podcast, that there are two different views of understanding this relationship, at least two. One, it's a very narrow one, by which, politics and football only means, when fans in a stadium display something political, or the use of football for political purposes. Your prime minister, your dictator that uses football for domestic. This is an important part. Obviously, we're not saying that this is not it, but we're trying to look at it in a much broader way. And another thing that I think sort of Guy alluded to is that we also think that football it's a very good way of understanding, framing, and answering some of the big societal questions or political questions that we are interested in. So our podcast is not necessarily only sort of that relationship between football and politics, but also how does football allow us to make sense of some of the big questions out there. I think I have to say, one of the best features of the podcast so far has been how generous guests have been with their time and with their answers in helping us understand some of these big themes, whether it's racism or gender relations or inclusivity, or also like issues specific to some geographical areas. So I think that's another angle which it's part of how we understand this football and politics relationship.
And if I can just add to this as well, because one of the things that we're also keen to do, sometimes we fail a little bit, and we talked a bit about this before the recording, is how keen we are to make sure that it's a podcast where we bring in voices that aren't necessarily heard. So since we started doing this podcasting, we've been struck by how so many podcasts, and particularly when it comes to football, are people like us, white, middle-aged, male. And so, and sometimes we fall down in this in the sense that some of the guests we bring on are like us, but we really do want to hear from people who are unlike us or who have a different perspective or a different view, because I think their voices are just as valuable, if not more so. We don't want them to be drowned out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As everything that you guys have said there is really important. Football is about inclusivity and about giving other people platforms, and that's what we should be doing. But just to go back to what you guys said, just kind of through that bit of conversation there, what's important for me, first of all, is that you distinguished between this idea that football and politics can be the relationship with football to government, and also how fans express their politics. But there's also so many other angles that can be taken there as well. But I think it's quite important that you guys take a broad approach to it, because whenever politics and football is discussed, I think people can often get very overwhelmed and confused and start tripping up over things, because at the end of the day, and kind of part of what you just said at the end there, Guy, is that ultimately the field that we operate in is very academic. It's pretty exclusive, in some ways elitist. It's not always accessible for the majority of people who consume football. And in that sense, we are quite privileged in the sense that we're actually able to understand and access it. So when you get into conversations with people about politics and football, more often than not, it's a jump to, oh, these things shouldn't be together. They should be completely separate. And a lot of the time, it just comes down to why people understand it. And it's because they don't understand it. And it's because it's so confusing and such a minefield to try and navigate all of these things that exist within politics and football, because as well as it being the relationship with football clubs and government and fans expressing their identities, it's also, you know, whether or not people in football clubs are allowed to come in and feel safe in the club due to their gender identity or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's whether or not a football club is receiving money from a public investment fund from another country. It's whether or not, you know, the club is viewed upon kindly by the local community and the local council. So
I wonder if you have anyone in mind, Rory, in the last two categories. I wonder who you're thinking of.
But yeah, no, I mean, it's politics and football is so many things, and not all of them are negative. In fact, I would probably say it's a reasonable 50-50 split between them being negative and not. And a lot of people I find are quite keen to take shots at clubs which express a specific political identity because they don't agree with it. Obviously, that's just part and parcel of politics, but also because they don't think that it's right, which is something I don't necessarily agree with. I think football and politics has always been mixed and can't be separated, and trying to separate it is just denial of reality. But you know, I suppose, actually, Francesco, from what you said there, it's quite a nice way to move on to some examples of how politics and football interact with each other. I mean, obviously, you've got the obvious examples which come to mind for me, which are like Athletic Club, Newcastle, probably the example that Francesco was thinking of just there, who have just effectively been bought over by the Saudi Arabian investment fund. Those are the obvious ones, but what are some of the more difficult and more complex examples of politics and football interacting that you can think of?
The most complex. Well, I think, I mean, just drawing from the episodes that we have done, I think that what it's very complex and very rich is for us, it's when you look at countries and contexts that we're not familiar with, and we use politics as a way of understanding that. So we've done for example, episodes on the politics of football in West Africa and Ghana in particular. So we looked at different dimensions, right, from like national team to the clubs there, to the sort of ethnic and sectarian divisions, ethnic particularly in that case that you might have. So I think the complexity there is in the sort of different levels that you can look at. In terms of clubs, I mean, we've done so many of them. I mean, one thing we didn't mention, and I think it's something we've done recently, and I think it's very rich in terms of football society relations, are fan-owned clubs. We've done one recently, very recently, with Exeter City. We've done Clapton Community Football Club in the past, and
we've talked to Fulham Lilies, and
we've talked to Fulham Lilies from
New York International.
From New York International. They're fantastic. So I think that's perhaps not the kind of high politics. You know, there's not the sort of geopolitical dimension there, but it's so important in terms of what we want to do, and it's got such a big level of complexity in terms of relations between club and community.
I mean, the striking thing for me is that obviously a lot of the high politics, if you want to talk about, is just what Rory was alluding to. You know, these kind of the big sort of the big clubs who are getting sort of massive amounts of funding from, you know, sort of overseas investment funds. But I think the interesting thing about then, of course, at the other end is, of course, the community or fan-based clubs, because in a way it's not just about the football club, it's about how it connects to the wider community as well, about how it engages, how it becomes part of, what it does to create some mutual benefits between them, and that's something that we enjoy. I mean, it's a nice kind of respite to sort of a lot of the frustration and anger we see in sort of, I guess, what you would call corporate football, I suppose.
Yeah, because I know people can obviously look at Manchester City and say, well, that's politics in football because of the CFG and things like that. People can look at Celtic and say, well, that's politics in football because they're a diaspora club. Whereas maybe they'll perhaps look at a club like Exeter City or Motherwell and say, well, these guys aren't really political, but they're both fan-owned football clubs. They're both very, distinctively within their community.
Yeah. One thing that does strike me, and I'd be curious to hear what Francesco thinks, and it's probably actually relevant to you as well, Rory, which is this, a lot of these football clubs, when they were first set up, do represent a particular community, right? They represent a particular ethnic side or religious side, we can think, or, or a local area, sort of, work. Think about all of the clubs that were set up in England, to start with, and even further afield, but they represent a working community or a church or whatever that might be. Now, a lot of that has been lost, but it's interesting how these some terms are sort of still shorthand, right? So, for example, we did an episode recently looking at, sort of the violence that followed the Ajax Maccabi Tel Aviv match, and in it, Francesco started talking about the sort of the particular communities associated with Maccabi Tel Aviv and other football clubs in Israel. And one of the things that I was struck by, because we're very much interested in what happened in Amsterdam that night, and so in the sense we forgot to make reference to the fact that Ajax is often sort of seen as a Jewish club, and yet how Jewish is it really? Possibly in the past, historically, it did, but today it's more sort of a flag waving exercise for many people. I mean, but what is interesting to me, and I guess this is the tension that we're still kind of working with, is to what extent do clubs really represent these communities in any kind of substantive way? I mean, and if you take, for example, Celtic, I mean, your own club, I mean, the Green Brigade has become very, visible of late, particularly during the Gaza War, and the banners that it's put out there, and the penalties that the club's incurred because of it. But you do wonder how. I mean, especially when you look at sort of the management of Celtic, how aligned they are to their fans on that. So what's interesting to me is how people, and again, this comes back to the political, that yes, there are these historic origins of clubs, but today they are they're entities in which you can kind of read into them what you will. So people take from them the historic past that they associate with it, or they put into it their own particular views and opinions.
Yeah, can I say though, Guy, this just to add to what you said, it was very interesting that it's often like, and Rory mentioned James Montague. It seems to me that often fans, whether rightly or wrongly, kind of remain as custodians of some values of the club, and then in itself, it could be seen as a political fracture with the management, and that's something that one thing that we found very interesting. We've done a few episodes on it, but I think we should be doing more as football. It's the sort of politics of from the footballer's point of view, where there is a sort of power dynamics within clubs. We have looked at, I'm a trade unionist myself, so I want to mention that. We have looked at FIFPro, we had an excellent episode on that. We have looked at some footballers as political icons, and we've looked at Maradona.
We also did an interesting one which compared and contrasted Pelé and Garrincha.
So that level, I think it's very interesting, and it's as well complex.
That's what I'm looking for, though, is because we're discussing a really what ultimately is a very, very complex subject matter. But I think what you guys have just mentioned there's a lot of layers there, which is quite important for our discussion, because just to use Celtic as an example again, the distinction between how people perceive football clubs when it's the fans that give them their identity as opposed to the actual club, because at the end of the day, 90% of football clubs in 2024 are businesses, right? That is what it is. You can't really deny that. And in the case of Celtic, it's really the fans that give the club their identity. But obviously Celtic were founded to be the representation of the Irish community within Glasgow. And while that is still used by the football club and still used by the fans, which is why they fly Palestine flags, because they feel due to the heritage of many of the fans. They feel that there is a solidarity there with what's happening to the people of Gaza. But the football club, in terms of an entity, in terms of a PLC, they don't align with that whatsoever. In fact, there's always been rumours at the very least that the majority of the board at Celtic are actually on the complete opposite side of their political worldview, in terms of if we're talking about left or right. So that's quite an important distinction, but the club still taps into its Irish heritage. It still very much, in a public sense, takes a sort of leftish leaning approach, which is quite interesting in itself, because then you have these different dynamics between fan and club and other perceptions. And then from what you said, Francesco, you also bring players into it. How do players then balance that if they're technically working for the club, but say, for example, they themselves are a fan? So I suppose, Socrates probably comes to mind, the Brazilian player. But, there's all these different kind of elements that you have to take into account when you talk about this subject as well.
Yeah, I think an excellent example there. It's also recently you mentioned the genocide in Gaza. I think an excellent example is the division among formerly allied or friendly leftist clubs that split, San Pauli, Celtic, and some others over their position on the Gaza issue. I mean, and that's kind of is an example of transnational networks, but also of how central this is to these clubs, to these fans, rather.
Can I also add, we also did an episode on Mo Salah, and one of the things that was interesting about that when we were discussing with our guest was what had happened since October the 7th and the Gaza war, because Mo Salah has pretty much been a bit reticent, shall we say, about speaking out about it, and we talked a little bit about how that affected his brand. So, there's also something else that I also think is really important to say, is that when people talk about, football, and Francesco has done work on this, but my take on it was when you talk about football and, being apolitical or there are actors or organizations out there that insist on trying to separate the two. I mean, that in itself is a political act.
Correct.
Your choice to say that this is apolitical is a particular choice, a particular intent. So, this idea of being neutral, I mean, neutrality is a choice. Neutrality is a political position. Even this idea that football and politics can be separate just doesn't work for me.
I completely agree with you 100%. Within that, obviously, everyone always says, well, if you sit in the fence, that is a choice. If you choose to not get involved in one or the other, that is ultimately a choice. Whether or not it's something that you agree with or like or see as being political, it ultimately is. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's quite an important statement as well, because you've also got clubs like Union Berlin, who we done an episode on. Obviously, a former East German club, and there's a lot of dynamics within their fan base about some of their fans grew up in the East, some of them grew up in the reunified Germany, and there's a lot of kind of heritage and political elements at play within that fan base. But while the club don't position themselves as apolitical or try and say they're apolitical, what they say instead is, we're just here to have a good time, we're here to have fun. They're just there because it's a safe space for them, which in itself is a political choice as well, because they are in a roundabout way saying we're not political, but it's also a different way of saying, actually, this is just a bit of an escape, which is also valid in itself as well. But I completely agree with you, Guy, that football clubs that distinctly say we don't want to have a political stance, that in itself is a political choice. And at the end of the day, again, coming back to this dynamic of between club and fan, if the fans decide that that's not something that the club is speaking on their behalf for, then that's problematic.
Yeah, I think what you guys said applies also to, and probably even more to, international sport institutions and FIFA in particular. Yeah. I mean, FIFA is a fantastic example of fake sport neutrality, because it's neutral when it wants to be, and then it launches peace initiatives. Let's play football together. Let's be friends when it wants to. So in that case, neutrality is such a political choice. And
I think most recently, I mean, if you think about sort of the COP talks, the recent climate talks, you had Infantino talking about the important role that FIFA is playing in, contributing towards environmental sustainability. Just as we've had a 3-continent World Cup proposed that's going to be taking place in a few years' time. I mean,
those were a lot of examples, and again, a lot of them are very complicated, but it's kind of explained why politics is present within football, and we can go back to the historic nature of it. Guy, you already kind of touched on it. A lot of football clubs were formed to represent working communities, people from, working groups from factories or diasporas, And this is quite important as well about the formation of football clubs and where fans in 2024 get their identities from and get their worldviews from. Some of it has changed, some of it has stayed pretty, kind of close to the bone in that sense. But I mean, I'm always quite cautious about asking why politics is present in football, because to me it is just it's kind of part and parcel of supporting football. Is it's going to be there, whether or not you choose to acknowledge it is your decision. But it's always kind of been a thing, and it's never really went away. It's just always been there because a football club founding for a team to compete from a factory is in itself political.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you go back to, if you go back, because we're being very, Anglo-centric at the moment, but if you go back to the FA Cup, right, the first decade or so, it was think about how football was formed. It was formed, the rules were put together, and the major clubs at the time were effectively aristocratic, upper middle class, old boys from public schools. And so when you have, I think it's Blackburn Olympic wins the FA Cup for the first time in 1883, it is a significant moment because it's a works team that does this. And it sort of heralds a change. We start talking about the shift from football as kind of an elite, aristocratic sport to the people's game, which is kind of where we still are. And yet fascinating even still. So, I mean, there are still clubs today which maintain this kind of, contrast between, upper class versus working class. I mean, and just to give you a Brazilian example, because, I'm also, from there. In Rio, we have the classic Flamengo Fluminense. Flamengo is the club of the people, the Urubu, basically the vultures, whereas Fluminense is the club of the upper class. In fact, they still sort of call them the pão de arroz, sort of the rice powder, because one of their early players was a black player who had to whiten his face with rice powder before he went out onto the pitch. I mean, this is all from 100 years ago. And yet still they use these kind of reference points as a way of contrasting or distinguishing between these two clubs, when in actual fact, the fan bases of Flamengo and Fluminense these days are broadly similar. I mean, the social class of them is broadly similar. And yet somehow there is still, what I find interesting is that this still has resonance. These distinctions are made. And why is that? That in itself is an interesting question and poses questions about society and politics.
Absolutely. Well, if you look at Lisbon as well, I mean, take Benfica and Sporting, for instance. Sporting historically considered the club of the upper classes, the sports people. Benfica considered the club of the people, whereas now Benfica are the richest club in Portugal. Obviously, there's kind of some things happening in the background with them at the moment. And Sporting, although they are still rich, to us comparatively, obviously, they're nowhere near where Benfica are in terms of the money that they've actually generated. Even looking at Rangers and Celtic to a degree, Rangers, we are the people, they are their favourite tagline. But if you look at the political and historic, religious and social dynamics between what Rangers represent and what Celtic represent, Rangers were very much the club who were there to represent the establishment and to maintain the status quo. But of course, the fan bases in terms of class have always been pretty similar, always distinctly similar, but the separation has been that religious and kind of social aspect.
Yeah, and I think you see that in a lot of cities where they have, more than one club, right? It sort of provides the basis for the city population to differentiate itself.
Yeah.
Maybe less so where you have a city where there's one club. But, this does seem to be sort of a feature of 2-club or 2+ club cities.
The third club dynamic is quite interesting as well, though, because one example that I spoke about recently was kind of comparing Aberdeen and Porto. Aberdeen, as a kind of third entity in Scottish football, stand free is their tagline, the northern club. And then Porto are kind of the same as well, where they're looked down upon by the people from Lisbon, and they're up in the north and they have their kind of own thing going on as well. So politically, that's quite interesting as well, even though it only really manifests itself on the terraces. And these are just some of the ways that politics are present in football. You've got other things as well, like actual politicians turning up to games is obviously a very, very distinct example. But you
also see politicians trying to claim football clubs or football success as well, right? So, I mean, if you go back to sort of, the first time France won the World Cup, the leadership pretty much wrapped itself in the flag and sort of emphasized as well the nature of that French team as well. If you go back to the Euro 2020s, which took place 3 years ago, it was striking how in the run-up to that competition, how politicized it became, because many of the players, included, very sort of socially aware and socially active players like Marcus Rashford, who'd done some campaigning to get children fed at schools. And that team made a decision to take the knee, to emphasize the Black Lives Matter movement. And they got stick from it, from conservative politicians, including, what was his name? Lee Anderson, who said, I'm not going to follow England at all, during this, all the way to the final, of course.
Just think about the recent national elections campaign and the use, the efforts done by our current Prime Minister and the then Prime Minister to show themselves as men of the people by showing how much they liked football and they were going, only to find out later that their tickets were paid for, and it was. But so I think in this case, football it's an excellent tool for politicians to show that they are connected to us, the normal people.
Yes, and it's not just, obviously, the most obvious egregious examples are, dictators, and it goes all the way back to Mussolini and Hitler. But even sort of, even democratic politicians, will wrap themselves in the flag. So, or emphasize football. Even take Tony Blair. You guys are too young to remember this, but back in 1997, he in one of his appeals to demonstrate himself as a man of the people was to go out and do a couple of headers with Kevin Keegan.
Remember that? The thing is as well, it's that you've got. The one that always comes into my mind is David Cameron. I think it was, forgetting who he supports when he was asked. But then you've also got see the politicians that actually go to football games, they will never have to explain or make a huge point of it. Politicians will use it as a tool because they know how useful it is, because the power involved with football, especially the power of the mob and the power of the fans, is something that politicians want. You can see that with the likes of Erdogan in Turkey. You can see it in Egypt as well. It's a massive thing, and it's something that people know that they can use. But I think this all does kind of come back to the inescapable fact that football and politics can't really be separated. And it's wild that we're kind of discussing this, but again, I don't want that to come across as a condescending way. I understand why people say that and why people kind of want that, is because they see football as their escape from what is going on in the world, and that's fine. That's how I use it sometimes as well. Sometimes you just need that 90 minutes, and that's fine. If you choose not to acknowledge or engage with the politics at your football club, that is fine. We're not saying it's not. But what is problematic and what isn't fine is saying that they have to be separate or that they're not involved with each other, because ultimately they are.
Yeah, and almost in a kind of a passive way, to reiterate what you're saying there, Rory. Until recently I was living in Brussels, and I used to go to my local club, which was the Union Saint-Gilloise. And again, in Brussels you have two big teams, right? You've got Anderlecht and you've got Union. Well, Anderlecht is kind of, its support base comes from not just Brussels, but all across Belgium. But, Union pretty much gets its support base from the Saint-Gilloise neighborhood. Now, what I found quite enjoyable about going to those games was how diverse the crowd was, because we lived quite close to the European Quarter, so you had a lot of people who worked in the European institutions there. So you'd be standing on the terrace and you would hear all these different languages, Italian next to me, Portuguese, French. And what was quite nice was that, as you say, for many people, football is a release. But what I also think interesting is, just as an observer myself, sitting there watching this, I can see these people are coming just for the game, but actually their presence represents the nature of the community in which we were, which we live.
Yeah, if I can add, I think we did a fantastic episode at the very beginning with David Goldblatt, who is many listeners will be familiar with his work, who actually says that football stadiums are fantastic theaters. There doesn't have to be politics in an obvious way for them to be interesting from a sociological and political point of view, because they are spaces for people to express themselves.
So I think this is why I come back to the point I was making earlier, that when you asked us what is political about football and FootPol, our podcast, is that our interest is not in the obvious, explicit politics. We will do that, but we are also interested in sort of the broader ideas of how football itself is a conduit through which, social dynamics play out, and those social dynamics include people's representation, whether it's ethnic identity, religious, or whatever.
Yeah, it's the same as us, same kind of example. We're not just a podcast that talks about everything that's happened in football from 1990 to 1999. Do you know what I mean? Because that's just nostalgia. We don't sit and just talk about stadiums, because that would just be architecture. It's about how football is this social phenomenon and case study where you can look at things and pull apart all of these different heritage elements from it And it's something that can really help enrich your experience as a football fan, because you might not have known that that was there or that that was really a thing. But at the same time, one of the examples I always come back to is, I suppose, comparing the support of going to see Celtic to going to see my local club, which is in tier 8 of the football pyramid in Scotland. And it's like, at Celtic, you've obviously got people from all over the world. You've got a huge travelling contingent from Ireland who come over, whereas at Lanark United, there's never really any more than 100 people there, but it's all old guys, all grew up in the town, played for the club. They're there every week, and we chat because we all know, we all have the same kind of reference points from our locality. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But more often than not, although we're very much just like, okay, there's nothing really else going on here, this is just a small junior club, we're going to go and watch them. You always come together, you're always doing the same thing, and you always end up speaking about what's been going on through the week, whether that's politics, whatever it is. And I think that's quite important in itself, is that even if you are at a football club that on the face of it seems like the most unpolitical, just pure football thing imaginable, the people that you stand next to and speak to, you're ultimately going to be engaging in this social act. And that's part of it as well, is that even if you think you're going to the football for an escape and you use it as an escape, which is fine, you end up kind of speaking about stuff that is political anyway.
Yeah, and you just reminded me of an episode we did back in April where we talked to John Lowry, who was the author of Match Fit, and he talked about, you know, his understanding of mental health through football. And in what was really interesting was, you know, it wasn't just, I mean, he talked about his own experience on the stand and how, you know, football helped him with his mental health, you know, as both a spectator and a player. But also, you know, through his investigations, he looked at, you know, how mental health impacts on players themselves as well. You know, whether it's through injuries or afterwards. So it's a little bit like we were talking about. Football for us is a lens through which you can make sense of politics. I mean, the same sort of thing that was going through with, you know, with John's work. He was looking at football as a way of understanding, you know, mental health. And of course, mental health has its own, you know, political issues as well. Do you choose to fund it? Do you not choose to fund it? Do you make that sort of, you know, provided by the NHS, you know, by formal institutions or by, you know, community-based groups? So that's where it kind of became political to us. But I think, you know, it's interesting how you can sort of take, I think what you're doing in terms of heritage, you look at football, you know, in the broadest term through the lens of heritage, as you've alluded to, architecture, you know, sort of culture, attitudes. The same thing as we do it with football, you know, we do it with politics. But I guess in a sense, politics is maybe too blunt a term. Maybe we need to talk about power.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, and it's interesting how we can have this conversation and again, just sort of kind of unpick all those things. And again, obviously, a lot of our episodes kind of are inherently political because a lot of the histories of football clubs are political, but we're not a political podcast, and I'm quite keen that people are aware of that, although that it does come into a lot of what we speak about. I'm obviously a very political person. We are a podcast that focuses on football and heritage, but, you know, they're intertwined, and that's part of it. But, you know, we've got episodes out there like the one with the old county ground that we've done with Tom Reed from Terrace Edition and Martin, where we literally just spoke about what they remember of being in the old county cricket ground and watching Northampton, and it was brilliant. Do you know what I mean? But obviously there's other political things we can pull out from there as well, and I suppose this is where it's kind of relevant to us, is how political football can impact the heritage of clubs or fans and their identities, because I think that's a pretty big one as well.
Well, I mean, right now, if you want, a lot of clubs are facing the challenge of, you know, they're either outgrowing their stadiums or their stadiums are becoming unfit for purpose and they need to either renovate it or move, right? I mean, that is a big issue, right? Because if you choose to move, especially if you're, because in many places, you know, the football ground is part of the community, right? So the decision to move actually can fundamentally change the nature of the community around where the ground was, as well as the nature of the football going community. Because if it's out of town, you got to be able to get out there. I remember, for example, with, you know, back in Brussels, you know, Union was thinking about moving, and it sort of surveyed its fans to say, do you think you're likely to go to more games, less games? You know, what would be sort of the consequences of us moving? You know, can you afford it? If you're walking to the ground is one thing, but if you have to sort of take public transport, that's another thing entirely. And then, of course, you see clubs like Bury who went bankrupt, and they just had a ground sitting there empty, and that just ripped the heart out of the community. Yeah. So, you know, even sort of shells, I mean, sort of these kind of physical manifestations have some kind of, you know, political impact.
Going back to the concept of heritage, I mean, you said that rightly that, you know, it's not only about nostalgia or with it, but I think the concept of nostalgia is closely connected with heritage. and nostalgia is extremely political.
Are you plugging one of our episodes?
I am. I'm at least one. If only I remember the title, the name of the guy.
Jack Black from Sheffield.
Jack Black. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. With Jack Black, and I think like it is on many levels, and I think you can say in obvious ways. But also, like going back to the concept of community we were mentioning before, right? Was what Guy was saying. Think about the example of West Ham. I'm based in London, right? How much of their heritage has gone with the change of stadium? What has it meant in terms of them, in terms of their community? There is a tension there between sort of the politics of being a Premier League club and the demands on that, and the constant competition, the sort of the global Premier League that requires this sort of massive global league that is always about pushing more and always about improving. And you got West Ham as a club that's incredibly rooted in East London and has got a social basis. It's sort of a quite strong class component, a quite strong local component. So I think that's where, I mean, and if you talk to West Ham fans, they are incredibly nostalgic.
Yeah, well, no, you're spot on. I think that the example that I always come back to is Brockville and Falkirk. So Brockville was gone before my time, so I'm not the authority to speak in this whatsoever, but just, talking about and kind of considering the heritage elements attached to Brockville, it was 5 minutes from the central train station in Falkirk, within walking distance if you were from a bit more to the kind of further reaches of Falkirk, or the suburbs, if you want to use that term. Then it was one bus, you could get there easily. Obviously, huge amount of memories for people, a lot of nostalgia, as Francesco's touched on there, a huge kind of social hub for people. And then obviously Brockville had to be taken down because it was falling to bits because of investment hadn't been put into it, which is a shame and is political in itself as well. And now the new Falkirk Stadium is closer to Grangemouth. If any Falkirk fans are listening, they won't like me saying that, but it is. Which is a bit of a point of contention for rival fans. It's out of town. If you live on the other side of Falkirk, it's at least 3 buses. So, all of the things that we've just spoken about come to the fore there. But one of the big things that people kind of miss is that what replaced these old grounds, what replaced these things that were so intrinsically tied to place and community, what replaces those things where all these people had memories around this same patch of grass for so many years? It's a retail park. Can you replace what a football ground gave to the community with a retail park in terms of the intangibles and the tangibles? No, it can't. And this is part of the issue as well, is that people forget that these places where people would have went and stood in the same spot for decades, who then brought their children to do the same and their grandchildren to do the same, are now effectively gone, and that leads to a huge disconnect between club and fan base, because then they build these huge out-of-town bowls that are pretty soulless.
I don't know if you're aware of that, Rory, but Guy's trying to buy Aldershot Town, his club. So when you do that, Guy, please don't build like a massive stadium.
Well,
keep the stadium you guys have. It's important.
The Guy Burton Stadium.
It does not need to be named after me. No, thank you very much. It's
so humble.
It's called the EBB Stadium apparently, but no, everyone still calls it the Rec for recreation ground, right? But it is a bit of a wreck. And I mean, and what struck me, I was reading something about it. Some groundhopper about a week or so ago had written about going to Aldershot and saying this is a proper 1980s ground, and it's which. It is in many ways. But what I find striking about it as well is, yes, we have that. I mean, it's been stop-start discussion, about whether or not we get a new ground, we have to rebuild, or it is owned by the council, so you have to sort of do that with them. But what I find striking about it as well is that, just as you were talking about, moving ground or sort of grounds lying empty have an effect as well. What's striking is if you take a place like Aldershot is, historically the home of the British Army, but the Army pulled out there several years ago, and it doesn't have much of in terms of its economy now. I mean, it's a bit of a dilapidated, rundown place, in sort of the wake. And I should say I do have family connections there, so I'm not being negative about it in isolation. Sure. But it's one of those places that was left behind. If you think about Brexit and the sort of the towns and cities that voted for Brexit, Aldershot was one of them. But what's also striking, and when I go back, is to not, you see it's a little bit quieter, emptier and stuff, and yet at the ground there's not much left in Aldershot, but there is the football. And also next to it as well, we now have a Hindu temple, which is reflective or representative, I think, of the growing Nepalese Gurkha community that we have living there as well. So in that sense, it can also add to things as well.
Yeah, I'm sort of quite aware that we've been very sort of British or even English centric.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring an example from Italy, from my own country, because listeners might be aware that one of the main dramas around heritage and football in the last at least 15 years now has been in Italy around the issue of the Giuseppe Meazza, the San Siro Stadium in Milan, that both clubs have at different points said that it needs to be either renewed or they want to basically have a new stadium. Now, this is an incredibly glorious stadium that has got incredible heritage, so to speak, and perhaps is not entirely up to standard with some of the modern requirements. I know that clubs look at profit, so they want to have something that that can be more sellable and the different fun experience. But what kind of heritage there is there? This is one part of it. And the second, the way this has been dealt with. So how slow the process has been, how bureaucratic. It tells us a lot about Italy as a country and how politics in Italy works. So you've got the two sides there. Through that case, we would actually be able to say some things about politics in Italy, because in the UK we would have been managed in a completely different way.
True.
And if I can also add, if you don't mind, Rory, I mean, just to sort of give you sort of another example from my time in Brussels with Union. I mean, wouldn't seem very political on the surface, and yet when I think about it and I reflect, there is elements of political issues here. So take for example Union, their ground. I mean, the first time I went to visit it, it's only got one stand on one side and it's open on the other side, so backing onto a park. I mean, it was built in 1920 or so. So one of the first games it hosted was, I think, Spain's first international game in the 1920 Olympics. On the front of it, it's got these Art Deco motifs. It's a wonderful ground, right? And it's great for Belgian football. But now that Union is now back in the first division after 50 years and it's now getting into European competition, it's not up to UEFA standards. So what you have had over the last couple of years is that when Union has had to play European games, it has had to leave its home stadium and go somewhere else. The first season we played in the Leuven Stadium, so another town, about half an hour outside Brussels. Last year they played at the Anderlecht Stadium, and that was very interesting because what you saw was when they were talking about bringing in Anderlecht as the stadium, this actually generated quite a lot of animosity from some of the more established older Belgian fans who were saying, "This is our rival, we can't play there," because identity, right? But for the wider populace, the wider fan base, which has grown really only in the last few years because of the success of the club, they don't understand this historic rivalry, and especially if they're coming from overseas. Like I've said, you get a lot of diversity at a Union match. That for them it wasn't an issue, which I think is also telling. And yet, when you go to the Anderlecht Stadium for these European games, you are able to get way more into the stadium than you can in a home match. And yet, on the other hand, okay, yes, on the one hand, it is a sizable number, 15,000, but because it's a stadium of 30,000, it feels half empty. And that in itself creates its own problems because it doesn't have the kind of, excitement that you would expect on a European night because the stadium's only half full. But this is one of the interesting things that I think, something that doesn't on the surface look like a political issue, it is, because UEFA's has said you need to have stadia to certain requirements. That's a choice. How the fans react or don't react, that is also telling, I think.
No, I completely agree with you. And just on a smaller scale as well, just to talk about the kind of association interference within football. Obviously, they're there for a reason. They're there to administrate. No one ever likes them. Bonnie Rig Rose, who are in League 2 in Scotland, so Tier 4, they recently were hit with a fine because the SFA decided that their pitch wasn't up to standards because effectively there's a very small lump or hill on the corner flag. And Bonnie Rig Rose's ground is very well known as being horrible to go to because the pitch is in an awful condition. But basically now, for their licence to be renewed for next season and to stay in the Scottish professional game, Bonnie Rig Rose now need to spend probably the equivalent of around £250,000 to landscape their ground, which for a League 2 club in Scotland could bankrupt them. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a huge decision, and they've given them a year to do this.
You also flag up, this is why podcasts like, The Price of Football have become so popular, I think, and significant. But I think, that's why I think, precisely because of these things that, people are curious, they want to know more. And I think this is where, I think we're in a very interesting period of podcasting at the moment because the kind of listeners we get our listeners who are interested in the subject matter that we have to offer.
Yeah, can I just add one thing, because we're talking about podcast, and Guy was very humble, but Guy is a serial podcaster, so maybe he can briefly tell us if he's doing something else. No?
Well, okay.
No, Guy.
All right, fine. So I do a small sort of a short format podcast, about 10-15 minutes, where I basically look at a topic that's happening in the news this week. It's a way to sort of keep me, sort of plugged in, and doing, but it's not reporting on the news, because that's not what I do. I'm interested in sort of the bigger picture behind it. So that's one thing. And
it's excellent. Can I say I'm a listener? It's really, really good. So I would encourage people to subscribe to it.
Well, Francesco isn't listening to the other one because, as I said to you at the outset, I'm not really someone who can talk about football, but I've increasingly found myself doing so. So I sort of do some podcasting with the guys over at one of the Aldershot podcasts. So we talk about, they are much better at talking about the game than I am. I usually talk about, form and, betting odds and all that kind of stuff. So.
Obviously, the FootPol Podcast is your go-to podcast for everything politics and football. And as Francesco and Guy have mentioned today, it's not just about the obvious. It's about the bigger picture, the wider implications, and the things that we look at that we might not necessarily count as politics, but ultimately exist there. And as Guy's been quite keen to say today, it's about power. It's about the power dynamics that exist within our football clubs. Is there anything else that you want to add to that, just about your podcast, just before we finish up?
Just that we have an episode now every Monday, and so people should check it out. And we've got some fantastic episodes lined up. And then the other thing I want to add is that it complements very well what you guys do at the Football Heritage. So people should download double every time they download one of yours, download one of theirs, and the other way around.
Absolutely. No, this has been a great conversation. It's one that I've been looking forward to for a long time. Obviously, we recorded our episode when I came on the FootPol Podcast, and I think it was May or June, but obviously that was when you guys were taking your summer break, so the episode came out in September. And so it's brilliant to finally get you guys on for a conversation, and I'm really hoping that we manage to have a few more chats collaboratively in the future.
Yeah, no, sure. And what was good is with your episode as well, because we both listen to your podcast, but obviously you're very focused on particular clubs or events or times and stuff. So what I found very valuable and enriching was listening to you to give us some kind of broader comparative take, sort of the broader-ish experience of why particular clubs, go under, if there's sort of common themes about that. So, for listeners who are worried about their club, it's well worth sort of keep, paying attention to it so you can sort of catch out the danger signs, but also what you can do to,
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Yeah, I do like bringing this kind of storytelling element into it where it's, we look at wider issues through a particular case study. So if any of our listeners are getting anything out of that, then brilliant. As I said, this is very fun for me. So in a very face value sense, it's me talking shit about football. That is just something that I like doing. Do you know what I mean? So if people are getting something out of it, then that's brilliant. But I can't recommend enough for any of our listeners to go and check out the FootPol Podcast as well, because again, it's just a good insight into what's going on in our game. And, I think it's something that is going to become far more important as the years go on. It's already something that is very important. If it's something that you find yourself maybe struggling with to understand, the FootPol Podcast is a brilliant way to introduce yourself to some key concepts through these different case studies as well. So please do go and check them out. We'll put all of the information to their podcast in the show notes so that you can go and listen to that as well. It really is a brilliant listen. Of course, if there is anything that you want us to cover that we've maybe missed or that you think we should be featuring in the show, then please do get in touch with us. You can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. You can DM us on Twitter, that's @_footyheritage, and you can also message us on BlueSky, which is footballheritage.bsky.social. But for now, Guy, say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Francesco, say goodbye.
Bye, thank you, Rory.
It's a goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.